Good evening, everyone. Lunar eclipse just happened. Yay. My name is Defne Ayas, and I'm the director of Vitterevet. A big welcome back to you all, and those who have arrived in the later sessions, I also want to extend a welcome to you. Before we've heard all day about, we started with the age of criticism. In the age of super nerd, we've heard rather pessimistic views from masters of their pens. We've also heard optimistic views on a hybridization and an emphasis on style and language and how it's important actually it is to embrace the voice and define the voice as we go. There's still a distinction to be made between the art world and the culture at large, it seems, whether public matters or not, and when the damage all started. And it's a curious question that we have to keep answering here as well. Where is art versus culture versus public? In the dire situation of 18 to 22% illiteracy in the Netherlands and of 160 languages in Rotterdam, I mean, these are really serious conditions that we have to also keep grappling with as realities. Can we strongly cling to the art industry only when even esteemed public intellectuals don't find it appealing anymore? Don't we have to actually deal with that? In the age of coded rating and star systems, when there's so much confusion and when criticism in food and film are also in crisis, thanks for bringing it up, Vivian, when market research asks for less of art, where do we all stand in the ecology of it all in the age of information, communication, and interdependence? To disclose from our end, I also want to say that we've invited 4 more artists who couldn't be here. We tried, and we have to say they couldn't be here because of their schedules, but we acknowledge actually that there should have been at least more voices of artists heard. Also, in the following editions, I really hope we will be able to invite a collector or two, a gallerist or two, as well as a PR and communication person who does their job very well and who also, doesn't do their jobs well and completely violates the ethics of our ecology. I should also note criticism as conceived in the Western Hemisphere, which Aliakai mentioned, has also some intuitive counterparts in other parts of the world, such as the literati culture. And I think we have to understand these far more in depth before we make final judgments that it is only a Western conception and condition. And I hope we will be able to continue them in our next sessions. Most importantly, for those who don't know again, who just came, we organized and invited our guests to contribute to the context of the prize for Junge Kunstkritik that will be awarded tomorrow at Stedelijk. And the second part of the symposium will also take place at Stedelijk from 4 p.m. onwards. So without any further ado, I would like to say that also I hope what we're hearing today in terms of fragmentary storylines only provide us wonderful short circuits in our brain. And if we are in a situation that, we are in and need to control that process completely, that we avoid propaganda and manipulation in any way. So the idea that the symposium is open and authorship is shared with each other and soon with the audience with your Q&A is really important to us. So the next session is really about the urgency of independence in the age of interdependence. So I would like to welcome the next session speakers to the table.
Great, thank you, Defne. So you get to hear from me twice today. I'm moderating this panel. I was very happy to be chosen to moderate this panel because independence, and I think we're going to be addressing a lot of issues and what that might mean, and I want everyone to chime in. But part of the independence, obviously in this day and age, and I think we've heard a lot about it this morning, is about having a job, having funding, having the ability to actually write art criticism. And I think that's a really important issue that I'd like to start with. I'll tell you that one of the reasons when I originally started Hyperallergic with my husband was because I didn't find any opportunities to write online that were paid, or at least not very many. There were so few opportunities. And this was back in 2008, 2009. I think the landscape's changed a little bit in the art field, and maybe some people can correct me if they don't feel that way. But I think it's definitely changed, and part of it was writers standing up and saying, you know what, I need to get paid for what I'm doing. We need to find new solutions. We need to find new ways of doing things. And we've always prided ourselves in paying our writers and contributors a small amount, but still it's symbolic, because I think at the end of the day that's really important. So I guess we're going to start with each of. So let's figure out. I think I like the alphabetical by first name thing, because that was so different. So Aimee, you're first. Oh, you're right. Woo, someone got it. Ahu, you're the first. Okay, I apologize. It's just, I don't know why I thought, but hey, I stand corrected.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I think there's, in the past 6 or 7 years, actually, I've been attending these kinds of conferences where art criticism is constantly being talked about. And one of these was in 2006 when I attended an ICA conference. And the title was Critical Evaluation Reloaded. And again, it was about how art criticism was losing ground. And I remember at the conclusion, what came out of the conference was that the art critic as a type of person would be extinct in a few years. And 6 years from then, I feel that, is it happening? And is all these talks and books coming out about this? Is it like a lamentation? Has it happened? Has it finally happened? And where does that leave us as art critics trying to continue to write within this realm? My argument during that conference was that the disintegration of art criticism as we know it in some ways was linked to the rise of the independent curator, because the curator's position somehow combined the artist manifesto as a form with judgmental art criticism as a form. And because the curator was in an approach of choosing what we look at, what gets to be historicized, and how we should be looking at things and so on. So I felt that this was almost like a kind of visual criticism or a kind of judgment in visual form, and that and also in all these conferences that I attend to, the people that I would meet, everybody was more eager to curate rather than do art criticism in the sense that Anna Tilrow was talking about in the morning, because I also come from that kind of a art critic position, working in a newspaper. And so, a lot of people who work also for newspapers or journals or magazines, it seemed to me in the last 10 years or so, rather be in curating positions. And I think that was, in a way, one of the reasons why art criticism slowly declined. But then there are also views in recent years that, far from being extinct, art criticism is really flourishing in recent years, and we've also been hearing a lot about that in the sessions before. And I came across this book 10 years ago, actually. I'm sure you all know this book, and James Elkins is kind of obsessed with this issue of art criticism and how in what kind of a crisis it is in a worldwide situation. And I just want to read a little bit and then I will make a remark and then finish. I don't want to take too much time, but the beginning paragraph I just want to remind you of if you're aware of this book, but it says that art criticism is in a worldwide crisis. Its voice has become very weak and it is dissolving into the background clutter of ephemeral cultural criticism, but its decay is not the ordinary last faint push of a practice that has run its course, because at the very same time, art criticism is also healthier than ever. Its business is booming. It attracts an enormous number of writers and often benefits from high-quality color printing and worldwide distribution. In that sense, art criticism is flourishing, but invisibly, out of sight of contemporary intellectual debates. So it's dying, but it's everywhere, it's ignored, and yet it has the market behind it. And I thought when I read this book, I would just read it and then put it aside. It's a little book, but I kept on returning to this book within the last 10 years because the situation, the local context that I'm working in, just made me go back to this book all the time. I'm sorry, because I didn't prepare a proper 4-minute introduction, so you can, in the last 10 years in Turkey, because the promotion-oriented kind of dealer-critic style system that has become to be so prevalent was one of the reasons why I kept on going back to this book, and was also one of the reasons why I also started questioning my existence as an art critic working for a daily national newspaper, because a lot of what is published today in the local context, and I believe that it might be so also in an international context, judging from what has been said, is that editorial policy is very dependent on not critical judgment, but maybe promotionally and sensationally oriented approaches. So this also led to me to question, what am I being functionalized for, in what sense, for what? What is my function as a critic? These are the kind of questions that I constantly led me in a way to a kind of existential crisis. To be honest, I really didn't want to write anymore. But now, in the last, in recent times, I'm thinking maybe one has to not take this position. If one is an art critic, one has to really maybe work from a more individual standpoint. And if you're in a system of functionalization by this market-oriented imperialism, then maybe then you have to just, as writers, as you were saying in the panel that you were in, maybe we just have to, I don't know, go and open up a blog or find any way to voice your judgment, I would say, and standpoint in an independent way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I also just want to mention, for those of you who don't know the article, Ahu's article, "The Critic's Role in the Age of the Curator," is available online. So I would suggest reading it because it's a very interesting discussion about the identity blur between critic, curator, artist. So I think that's really great. So Aimee, you're next.
So thanks, someone have me here, and I'm so glad. I'm supposed to make some statement on this topic. I'm for an art criticism that is independent, and actually, given this topic, I for the first thought, I'm kind of like I don't know what to say, because this is so politically right that everyone cannot argue with that. And it's kind of like, it's you know, for art criticism or for art magazine or art newspaper or art section on newspaper, it is kind of like the first principle. It's kind of like in my past years practice, it's kind of like a song you are always singing, and every time you sing, everyone is happy. And but you have sang this song so many times that you kind of forget the meaning of the lyrics. You just sing it and everyone happy. So I think maybe this is the time if we are really going to talk about this. We probably will dig more into this question. And for me, it is a question that we all, for me as a magazine maker, also I'm a writer, and we all started from this goodwill or good wish to do something independently. But what happened when we are working on this, and slowly we realized that we kind of lose some part of independence. So what happened? This is, rather than make a statement, I propose this question. And also, it's also relevant to my own practice. It's we have to talk about this love and hate relationship with capital or with fund, which support us to do this distribution-based art media. So I think we will talk about that, right? And yeah, that's my.
Great, Brian.
Hi, thanks to Wit for inviting me here today. So in response to the question of the independence of art criticism, I wanted to prepare a short statement where I want to warn against a certain kind of melancholic idea of a melancholic return to the way that things were, and maybe I'll just deliver this now. So in any discussion about the independent position of art criticism, it can be useful to remember how the last moments of the new left in the West was characterized by a simultaneous demand for security and for autonomy. Security guaranteed by state support, and autonomy as a lack of interference in content. This model has functioned quite successfully in many European countries until recently, when the security provided by the state has diminished, leaving many artists and critics perhaps more autonomous, more independent than they would like to be. So in this sense, I think it's important to approach this question of the independent critic not as an ideal or something to strive towards, but actually as a position a critic or artist has little choice in. In fact, this precarious yet independent position is the norm for most cultural workers where state support is not available. It's a kind of freedom that does not feel free at all. And so then we start to end up in a scenario kind of like we're on Facebook, similar to what Jörg was mentioning earlier. So maybe it becomes necessary to try to understand how the terms of this mandate to independence are actually changing the way that we deal with art and that we speak. It is maybe too simple to blame it on the art market. In fact, the art market is producing a very complex ecology. Many public debates now happen in art fairs, which are more accessible to the public than a public institution like MoMA, which charges $25 for admission. So there are very strange things happening that I don't think we fully understand yet, and we have to be a bit careful before we place the blame all in one place. So I hope we can discuss this a bit. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, there's a lot to talk about. So okay, So, Domeniek.
Okay, thank you. Thank you also for inviting me. I hope that you permit me to use this occasion to pay some attention to the situation Metropolis M is in. I'm working for this magazine for a long time already. The magazine is existing for almost 33 years now. We were always funded, but funding stops starting from 2013. That has its consequences, of course. First of all, I want to sketch a little bit, say a little bit about the magazine as such. The magazine is mainly read by artists, and it is quite a small magazine, quite a small organization. At the moment, let's say 2.5 people are working for it, and they are doing everything for it. So from the editing to the publishing task that you have to, the marketing and selling of the magazine. Starting from 2013, that will be 1.5 people working for the magazine, and that of course is very complicated in a situation that you also have to face digitalization. At the same, this magazine, as such, as it is still very important and reaches a lot of people. It is, if you can compare it also with this kind of institutions that we identify with, quite successful. The magazine reaches, every issue reaches about 10,000 people, mainly in the Netherlands and Belgium. So you can say that on a yearly base, the magazine is reaching more people than Witte de Wit and the Appel together. Even in a good year, we reach almost as much people as the Van Abbe Museum reaches. And this is, the Van Abbe Museum gets 5 million euros per year. We won't get anything next year. So anyway, the magazine as such is still very important for us to survive. We have to find ways to earn money with it, and there we might or make use of ways that other magazines are using, and that means that you, as a magazine, you have mainly a kind of a commercial basis is your readership, of course, your subscribers, and you can see that all paper magazines are having difficult times and are adding all kinds of commercial supplements to the magazine. So I took with me the Groene Amsterdammer, which is a leftist magazine. So in a sense, quite you would expect a non-commercial operating magazine, but still it's producing all kinds of commercial supplements for which they are paid, and in which people from the magazine itself also write. So you can, and next to them, you can see that people from the organizations that paid for it are writing for the supplement. So it's a kind of hybrid situation that you never know what it's really about. But anyway, we at the moment as a magazine, and it's of course touching the question of independence, are discussing the fact if we would be prepared to do commercial supplements. In fact, we already started it in a slightly different way, but more in the sense like a publisher. But this one we did ourselves. We paid also for it ourselves, and it's kind of discourse-oriented, you could say. So it's quite serious. In fact, this one is an interview with Melvin Moti, and a long interview which we would publish in the magazine itself. But this one is another one in the series, and this one is have we been paid for? So this is you could say a commercial supplement to a Metropolis M, the first one. The point that I want to make is that the consequence of this is, of course, that you, as a magazine, which we were rather believing in our independence, and we have to face different situations in which it's getting much and much more complicated than it was before. That's mine.
And Sven?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with some of the previous speakers that, you know, a statement such as "I am for an art criticism that is independent" is quite problematic, precisely because we all feel forced to assent to it, because how could we not be for an art criticism that is independent? At the same time, we have to be careful that we don't revert or regress to antiquated and perhaps not very productive notions of independence or autonomy. You know, there's you can understand independence, you can understand autonomy in many different ways. So those terms would themselves have to be reevaluated and redefined, I think. But perhaps we can return to that. Perhaps I'd like to say one thing about kind of what I think is really of crucial importance in the present situation, when old structures and forms are collapsing, when new structures and forms are in the process of being born without yet being fully articulated. What's for me is of crucial importance is that art criticism can continue to function basically as a conversation. So I would say art criticism, you know, is not the lone heroic work of the critic fighting with everyone. Art criticism is actually something that happens within certain groups that you could term discursive societies. It's a term that Tom Hollert once used in a slightly different context, Diskursgesellschaften. For me, basically any form of art criticism that I can think of, that I'm interested in, historically or in the present, happens within that kind of group. And it can be very informal. You know, it need not be articulated in a very formal manner. But of course, those groups also, to some extent, will use or will produce certain platforms, certain media, certain institutions, for instance, art magazines, traditionally, historically. Now, when traditional forms are becoming problematic, traditional platforms are collapsing or are changing, how can we make sure that art criticism can continue to be produced precisely as a conversation that is determinate, that is precise, right? That's basically the group function, or this ongoing process of group formation and group dissolution produces. It's a precise, determinate conversation. So you actually need people who disagree with you, but who disagree with you let's say, in a very precise, determinate manner, so that you can actually have a productive disagreement rather than an abstract disagreement that you can have no conversation about. So that's historically one important, perhaps the most important crucial function of the art magazine as a platform for a certain discursive society that is, of course, constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly in crisis, you know, that's infighting, etc. So if, let's say, traditional funding models are now in crisis, for me, really the most important question is, how can we find forms, how can we find platforms, however they may be funded, that can make sure that art criticism can continue precisely as this kind of discourse, as this kind of focused conversation.
So I'm going to mention that when I was asked to moderate this and I was preparing for this this event, I actually crowdsourced my Facebook page for answers. Sorry, but it was I actually crowdsourced to get kind of a sense of what people were thinking, and I think we're hearing a lot of some of the same issues where the idea of what independent actually means is kind of different to everybody. What does independent mean? So part of it I'm really kind of curious about is, I mentioned the issue of funding. Now, is independence, does that have to do with funding? I mean, is it, when we say it, I mean, at the end of the day, does it mean like being able to eke out a living as an art critic? Is that really the essence of it?
You know, you can think you're independent because you're eking out a living and because you're being paid for it, but of course at the same time you're entangled in all kinds of market and other mechanisms. You can think you're independent because you're not making a living and you're basically doing it as a hobby, right? And that will increasingly happen. This phrase of hobbyism, of a left-wing hobby, will in a sense come true because people will have to work as hobbyists more and more. But it's not really productive for me to ask the question and to pose the question in those kind of very general terms. In each situation, no matter what situation you're in, you will constantly have to sort of arrange yourself with certain conditions that you don't necessarily approve of, and you will have to make the best of it. And that would be one sort of banal, down-to-earth definition of independence or of autonomy. Trying to do what it is that you want to do in a given situation with all the sort of entanglements, with all the heteronomy that comes with it. So yeah, you could work as a blogger who isn't paid for his work, so you may think you're outside the market, but of course at the same time you're marketing yourself with your blog. So
there is something, I'm talking from the local context, there is something I would call hospitality funding in recent years in the Turkish art world, where, for example, museums can take you on a 5-star trip to Paris or Amsterdam or wherever, and then on your return, you will be expected to write a piece on what in your newspaper, in your journal, in your blog, whatever. So there are lots of these hospitality trips, which is interesting, and also it's becoming a very festive kind of atmosphere where there are lots of dinners. I mean, constantly you are invited to dinners, and I read somewhere where art critics are seen like the poor relation in the art family, and you're constantly made to feel as if you are this poor. I mean, you're constantly invited to these dinners, as if you have to go and have these dinners, and you're constantly invited to these parties. You're constantly invited to these every 6 months or so. If a museum is going to have a big exhibition, like a blockbuster show, they will take journalists to see the artist who's going to be exhibited in Turkey to be seen at that space, so that it's like we are showing you this important artist in his or her real place, and then you come back, you see it in the museum, and then it's almost also like a kind of modernist paradigm continuing, where museums and privately funded institutions are seen as like the educators of the public. And if, as a critic, you go against the tide to criticize in any way these endeavors, the way they go about doing these things, then you're seen as, oh, why aren't you in the game? What do you mean? That kind of thing. So it's very difficult to keep your own independent voice.
I just wanted to add to that the hospitality. I think there's actually even another trend where I know that we've been approached by a museum to actually publish articles that they would pay us for, but we can't say they're sponsored, for instance. So, I mean, that's even cutting out the trip. So, just so.
Okay, well, I just want to say that funding, of course, is not creating this situation of independence, but creating another dependency. Of course, it's also serving all the market. And for me, or for us as a magazine, it's important that you can say what you want in the magazine. And of course, the consequence of that you say what you want might mean that you lose advertisers, which happens now and then, of course. But this independency thing is mainly not so much the fact that you are serving a market, but the fact that you can speak freely.
In terms of being independent and making a living, I would just say that in order to be independent, a very basic prerequisite for it is to be alive, right? You must be alive first in order to be independent, right? I mean, so if we are talking about if we're talking about forms of support and funding, we also have to recognize that within the field of art, we are dealing with vastly different scales. We're dealing with with artists who can be extremely, extremely poor and still produce work with very little means, or they could be extremely rich and also produce work with using very little means, right? It's a kind of like, you kind of see it in Hollywood, where someone will be a huge star one day and eating out of a dumpster the next day because things didn't go well with the last film. So the stakes are very high, and so it's important to distinguish, I think, between these different scales. Yeah?
Yeah, and perhaps adding to that, we really need to get away from this idea of either independence or autonomy as, a structural given. Like, okay, how can we achieve the state? There's this certain nostalgia now, certainly in Holland, who once art and the art world, they were autonomous, and now, we're in crisis and we've lost our autonomy. I mean, I'm now presenting a caricature of a caricature, obviously, but, for the sake of argument, autonomy, I think, can only ever, or independence can only ever result from an engagement with, conditions that that work to undermine this autonomy or this independence. And it's an ongoing process. You never achieve it. You never achieve independence. You never achieve autonomy, except, in moments that are gone before you realize it. Yeah, it's relational, absolutely. So in that sense, we should get away from sort of Manichaean discussions of sort of a blessed state of independence on the one hand and evil market forces or whatever on the other side. It just, we're inside the market. We're inside some market. If we think we're outside sort of the big Gagosian market, then we're part of an academic market or some other market.
Right. Okay, I understand. Aimee, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Actually, I cannot really join this conversation because this fund thing never really happened in China. But we have another. The old system never check. Really. The old art system is not working now in China. But we, new generation art magazines or art media, as new founder. That's the in recent years, in last 3-4 years, there are news groups. They are not professional. They are new to art world, but they are expanding and they want to have everything in their on their map. So slowly, after they have like newspaper, lifestyle, fashion, and even boat, watch, jewelry, and they start to have like contemporary art magazine. That's what is happening now. So for some time, for maybe 2 years, me as a content maker or magazine maker had this feeling that we kind of reaching to a state of independency because we don't, with our parental company, we don't have to 100% depend on advertisement from art world. That means gallery and museum and blah, blah. And because we sell also advertisement to, for example, Chanel, which is 10 times the rate than an average gallery advertisement. So we think we have 40 pages of review section in this 216-page magazine, only for review. And we ask our authors, write what you want. And we make sure they are not, they could know the gallerist or they know the artist, but they don't have a, extra relationship with them. That means the gallerist didn't pay them. That happened in other publication. And also we have other section. We just have this section. We want our authors to write honestly, but you think you're independent from commercial art, but the company give you another challenge because they want to say advertisement to Chanel. So we have this term called advertisement environment or advertise context. So that's our job, our editor's job, to make this context in our art magazine, so that a Chanel advertisement is not weird or not unique, not alien in this magazine. So we have to do something else. And I think this is the beginning of the losing of independency. And I can add more. Of course, for example, as an art magazine, we have fashion section, and we do fashion shooting. And for some time, we tested for some times. Then we came to this step that we want it to be a visual work, simply a visual work, not the fashion shooting in a fashion magazine. So we invite artists to do this. And we think probably the clients will like it. So we have this advertisement context, while we can actually, as a magazine, to initiate some real artwork. And that's a very good dream, but we don't have enough time to make it really good and even make those visual work into multi-edition artwork, so that this section can fundraising itself. But before that, the boss said enough. We don't like that.
So that would be, you're talking about commissioning artists to create advertising?
Yes, that's what we did before.
Well, I think one of the issues with a lot of the discussions I was having was integrity is sort of like the base of independence too. Because at the end of the day, if someone is, financially independent or otherwise, really at the end of the day, you're looking at a person's integrity. And you're kind of judging their independence based on that and their relationships and the transparency of those types of things. Now, one of the things that actually came up during lunch and was something that I had been thinking about is, what is the role of branding in this day and age as an art critic and wanting to keep your independence? Because a lot of us aren't writing for one publication anymore. A lot of us aren't writing for one thing or being employed full-time anymore. Now, do you see a role? Do you see, I personally notice a rise in branding, in personal branding as art critics. Does anybody have any comments on that? Or do you think that's true? Or do you yourself brand yourself?
Surely we hire professionals for that. I don't know. Okay, I guess, it's true that probably people these days, work for, sort of have more different outlets, and they're not necessarily affiliated with one magazine or journal, for instance, anymore. That's actually sort of a change, I would say, in forms of group formation. But okay, if I look at myself, I write for e-flux journal occasionally. That gives me different opportunities, different possibilities, and presents me with different constraints and different problems compared to, say, Text zur Kunst. Text zur Kunst is more of a traditional art magazine in some ways. They have a review section. e-flux journal obviously doesn't have a review section. e-flux journal has a much stronger curatorial component, whereas Text zur Kunst is more firmly in the hand of art critics and theorists. So yeah, you have to sort of work within these contexts and try to exploit them and sort of somehow turn constraints into something that is productive. And then, okay, the question of branding. So you're operating within these different contexts. You're part of several groups, several discursive societies, or you're part of a network that encompasses different discursive societies. And do you brand yourself? It's hard to say. It depends on how wide your definition of branding is. Okay, so I have a blog, for instance, on which I list my publications, I suppose.
I think that's branding.
That's branding, yeah. Okay, so yeah. And then I would also, stimulate and encourage, people who are starting out now and they're actually doing it to do something like that, or perhaps to use the net much more, in a much fuller sense than I do, because I just basically list my publications, so I don't actually blog properly.
How about you, Brian? Do you find that you use branding at all in your work? Your personal branding?
Well, I would like to think that I brand myself as something similar to what I am. Yeah. It's important.
Is that all we're getting from you?
Maybe that's all I've got for now. Yeah,
Okay,
personal
perfect.
branding. Yeah, for personal. Yeah.
Personal. Aimee, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think we used to have this in our profession, something called reputation. But now we don't use that word anymore, we use brand. So, yeah, I used to have a aimeelin.com something, but I stopped it.
Well, I saw you on Weibo earlier. Were you on Weibo?
Oh, yes, but I haven't used it for like more than 1 month. The last time I used it because my hair stylist asked me to Weibo for one, so he gave me like a 15% discount.
Really?
So it's not about art criticism independency, but it's really marketing.
But it's marketing, but it's also branding. In some ways, it's like, wow.
Nothing to do with my profession.
Right. So, I mean, I have another question that's sort of, because I mean, like the definition of independence is obviously very broad. So, what would your fantasy be of being an independent art critic? What would that mean to you as an individual? Ahu, do you want to chime in on that? Like, what would that mean? Would it mean getting a grant from the government and being able to write whatever you wanted? Would it mean working at a publication that had 2 editors editing your pieces for you? And what would that fantasy of an independent art critic be?
The most comfortable position would be that I would write art criticism and not get paid for it, but I have lots of money from somewhere else. I think that's the most comfortable position for an art critic, because, like you were saying, in any position, you are in a position of, being in a market. And even your question, which was very, very interesting, about branding yourself as a critic, it seems really strange question, but yes, isn't Clement Greenberg a brand in that sense? And don't you still need the brand of an art critic to legitimize an artist? You still do. So maybe that's why art critics aren't extinct, will never be extinct. But I mean, I think my ideal position in fantasy would be that I can just write for free.
Do you have some thoughts on what that would be?
Well, in the current situation, it's quite easy to think of, in the sense that that I have less and less time to write more serious articles. But it is, in fact, that I think that, and maybe it's a bit what Sven also said, that the nicer thing is when you can write for different platforms and different audiences and communities, so to say. And so that's a sort of my ideal position as an art critic myself, and to live from it, of course.
I'm going to ask this question, and I'm going to assume I kind of know what people are going to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Now, do you think that the sources of your funding influence what you write about?
I think it does, but I must say that my experience as an art critic, that I felt most free in writing for the paper, so to say. And so the magazine is already somewhat more complicated thing, but also because I'm an editor for the magazine. As an editor for other text, I don't have that experience so much. It's not that I really feel influenced by it, but it was when I wrote for the paper, and currently I don't have much time for it, I felt most free to write whatever I want. Of course, there were different sorts of problems that has a much wider audience, so you have to bring up things in a different way than you are used to in the magazine.
Were you given the pressure of traffic or anything like that, writing for a newspaper? The
newspaper, simply the editors didn't understand what I was saying, so I had to explain it sometimes. So apparently you can, at least for Metropolis, you can write more complicated things, about more complicated things in a complicated way. But apart from that, Well, it is, of course, that you sometimes you have what I would call commercial commissions, in the sense that you write for certain kinds of books, and I have met often quite some problems with it to getting it published, because I tend to be quite critical also when it's about a kind of festive publication, and people don't like to be the censor, but they also don't like to publish criticism about it. So there you see that there is always a kind of tension involved. But until now, I managed to settle it in a way that I was happy with it.
Brian, any thoughts?
Does the source of funding? Okay, so does the source of funding influence what e-flux journal publishes? Right.
For instance.
Okay, would be the question.
Or any other publication you've been involved in.
Okay. Well, I mean, in the case of e-flux journal, no, it doesn't. Although, even if what we publish might overlap with our source of funding, it's also because we live in a small world, right? I mean, okay, so one thing that I keep thinking about in this conversation, which I think could be interesting to mention, was a small publication that Mats Stjernstjert from Kunstnernes Hus in Oslo mentioned to me maybe a year or two ago, where at Kunstnernes Hus, he was starting a small publication completely composed of writers from the staff of the museum. So the publication is completely made by the staff, by paid employees, who I think write what they want when they want for this publication, and it is on the one hand fiercely independent and kind of convivial, kind of really beautiful idea, but then on the other hand, it's a staff endeavor, right? So everyone is paid by the museum at the same time. I think it's a really kind of interesting idea.
Aimee, did you want to say anything?
Of course, the funding has some influence on what we write, but technically, you can always do something to avoid or partly avoid that. For example, when I was the editor, I just try not to write myself. So when someone complains about, for example, invite one of our journalists or author to the exhibition, and the article turned out not so not 100% positive, I will just say, oh, but it's the freedom of the author. I cannot, I cannot be responsible for that. But of course, actually, I was the one encourage our author to write. And this is one thing. And also, if there's something like really very commercial, for example, some iconic architecture finish a monumental museum building, this kind of thing, and they have like a PR company to arrange everything. I think all the journalists are quite familiar with this situation, and we have a special section in our magazine. We have a color on the edge of the page. So this means we write this. It's remember what I say about this advertisement-friendly context. So that's part of that. Then as a writer, I don't know. Normally, for example, now I have to commission of catalog essay, and I don't think I will write anything negative or the negative about these two artists' works, because I say, yes, I want to write that because I like their work. Right. So it's not necessary I want to show off my independency, so I write something bad of them. And also, I think one thing importantly, just like I agree with you, technically, I try not to live only in artwork. I must confess, for example, I write for financial newspapers, so that I found myself. I self-found, so I don't have to really make a living on this articles I'm writing. So I have freedom to write.
I just want to ask you a question about something you said earlier during your statement. You mentioned distribution-based art media. Something about, what did you mean by that? I just wanted a clarification on that.
Okay, that's very recent thinking of mine. I think why we are so, when we are doing art magazine, why we are doing so many work not really make content, but we are doing so many complicated things, but not real content. So what we are doing? And I'm thinking maybe it's because this world of mass media, or these magazines, is spread out based on distribution network net we build up, which is really, really very expensive. It's more expensive than the printing and the paper cost. So this money we put on distribution, and we must make it even. So we do a lot of work on that. So I'm kind of like thinking of that. And at this age of Assange and Zuckerberg, do we really need to still, put so many money on distribution, on this old school distribution, and to make ourselves as content makers so tired, while we are not really making content, just to deliver things to our readers.
Got it. And Brian, I wanted to ask something about you said, because you talked a little bit about marketing. I was glad because of the way you addressed it, producing a complex ecology. Mm-hmm. And then you also said something that you thought sometimes the art fairs make things more accessible than MoMA, mm-hmm. which I don't know if I agree with totally, but I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Just in entrance price. Yeah, I mean, I meant that in terms of entrance admission.
But in terms of the market and ecology, what do you think as a critic? How does the critic fit in there? Because, I mean, we've talked earlier about, is the critic then a cheerleader? Is the critic then somebody who's helping the marketing of a product? I mean, what is the role within that market ecology? And I'm asking this as a little bit of a devil's advocate, even though,
Well, I was okay. I mean, so speaking of MoMA, I mean, I was just at MoMA, I think last week, and it was, I think, the second day of Martha Rosler's garage sale, right? Which was there. This was so this was kind of interesting because I went to this garage sale, which is like a kind of suburban garage sale in the middle of MoMA. And I had a very strange, I bought maybe 2 little trinkets from there I argued Martha down from $15 to $13. And as I was walking out with these, I had this incredible feeling of kind of this incredible affirmative feeling, as if I had, and it was really like being both a member of the public walking into a museum and a collector at the same time, where you go in and you look through kind of, you're faced with a pile of stuff, and you look for what you identify with, and you have some kind of a contact with it, which was a transaction in this case, but this transaction can be many things. And I walked out with something, right? And so this was literally a market as a garage sale, but the contact with the works, so to speak, took place on a different scale than kind of Damien Hirst, of course, right? So this is maybe just a very, very simple story for describing how these different forms of interaction overlap. Yeah.
And how was the role of the critic in that? Because that's why when you mentioned market ecology, that's why I was like, what's the role of the critic within that ecology?
To make it apparent, yeah.
Make the system apparent?
Make it the complexity apparent, yeah. I would say.
Yeah, so it's really important to not see the market as being elsewhere, right? Being out there and then somehow threatening us, influencing us. I mean, we have to deal with constraints. I mean, that's no sensational insight. We're always operating within and hopefully against certain constraints, and those are different in the case of Text zur Kunst. They're different from art form. With Text zur Kunst, once a well-known artist wrote an angry letter to the editor because he claimed that I'd damaged his market in the United States, which was completely ludicrous. But I mean, those are
that's powerful.
Well, but I mean, it was his paranoia. I mean, it had no bearing on reality, and the editor basically told him not to be a big baby, But those are, those little incidents, they're few and far between. What's much more fundamental is really just sort of the general constraint that you have with, for instance, an art magazine that's dependent on advertising. So you have the gallery review section, and there's a certain form of pre-selection. What should we focus on? I mean, those are actually the real constraints, not, some artist or some gallery owner actually trying to sort of up the pressure and make you do something. That's really a rare exception, but that happens.
So one more question for everyone. So what is the responsibility of the writer and the limits of the writer within the idea of art criticism being independent? I mean, what do you feel a responsibility to your reader? And what is that responsibility? Just a light question at the end of the day. Ahu, do you want to start? Take a mic. No? Okay. Nobody?
I tend to say, of course, and but it's also quite abstract. But it's when it goes about my own writing, I have to be honest to myself, of course. So, and that I don't have the experience that I have regrets about the text in that sense, the way that you mentioned. And so I have the feeling that I've always been honest to the reader, whoever that might be, and I feel responsible to be honest, so to stand behind what you say. As an editor, that also you try to do it also, but it's somehow a little more complicated because you don't have everything in your own hand, so to say, and in the sense that you don't. We try to be. Actually, last issue we had an incident with e-flux. There's a text on e-flux in the magazine, and the author apparently is not has some. It seems to be as if the author has some sort of interest in writing this text that we didn't know about it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have asked him, of course. And it's a complicated thing because we still stand behind the text, but the author is a bit problematic, and you can indeed, now you read it in it. That's an example that we regret that we didn't function in the right way that we would have rather functioned than we normally do. And so there's an incident which I didn't have experienced within my own writing. So as a magazine, you also try to be completely honest and transparent, etc., about what is published. And about the e-flux thing, that will be in the next magazine, a letter by Anton explaining the situation, and then it's to the audience to think whatever they think about this article when they look at it again.
There are two, both of them I know. Okay. Okay. No, she wanted to say something too. I thought it was directly related to this comment, but I guess not. Okay. Amy, do you want to say what you're going to say?
Okay, so you're talking about responsibility as a writer to the reader. Mm-hmm. I can only say for me. As a writer, the only thing I think it's my responsibility to write is my attitude. So basically it means I will not propose something casual to them. I will write seriously and doing enough work and research and keep, that's it. And also one important thing concerning attitude is it's almost an open secret. Media persons think their readers are idiots. In mass media, maybe not in art. And so the attitude part, as the writer's responsibility is not think the readers are idiots.
Does anybody have anything else to add, or should we open it up to questions? Question. Go ahead.
A question actually to the people on this panel. I'm curious, like we could also sort of look at independence from a slightly different perspective, and I was wondering, how do you feel about a discourse or a discussion about art criticism being independent from a discussion about exhibition making or curating? Because I mean, I think Ahu, you touched on it, and I've been thinking about this, and it has been discussed as well. But I think it needs to be addressed here as well that a critic is not only a critic anymore, neither a curate is like someone who makes exhibitions. There's not only that anymore, but writes, and so these typologies, they seem a bit archaic in a way. And I'm just wondering, maybe Ahu, maybe you could address that a bit more.
Yes, I think in the identity of the curator, there's also the identity of an artist, because it's a creative endeavor, and then there's also, because of the criticality involved in both artistic criticality, but also it's a social critique of everything that's going on. It's a kind of parallel existence between the critic, artist, and the curator. And I think that's quite, I mean, in our interdisciplinary day and age, I think that's very interesting. It's a very, very interesting position. But also, when it comes to criticism, there's an insider position and an outsider position. And I think a curator, because of the networking through institutions, with other curators, with other people working in institutions, is in an insider position, is not in a position to be an outsider. And I think that's why some people have to decide to be, okay, they can be both, they can be a curator with a critical standpoint, but there has to be still the identity of the critic to be able to look from the outside and question what a curator is doing, either be it an exhibition, either the Biennale structure itself, the whole institutional framework. I mean, somebody has to be in an outside position, I think.
Sven, how do you feel about this? Because you're one who occupies these various positions from a very art historical perspective, of course, but still.
Yeah, so, I regard myself as an art historian who's also a critic, who occasionally moonlights as a curator, but certainly not as a curator. So, of course, there are different positions, right? There are different forms of authorship, different author functions, and the curator definitely comes with a different set of characteristics than the critic. But, okay, so what happens when those are no longer neatly separate categories, but people wear different hats? That obviously can create conflicts of interest, et cetera, et cetera. But, it might also potentially be productive. Yes, the critic obviously needs to be in a position, he or she needs to be able to take a critical stance vis-a-vis an exhibition. And I suppose that's more difficult if the curator is really sort of your direct peer. So it might be helpful if you are not primarily a curator as a critic, but as a curator, you could very well write certain types of critical texts that are very important, that are very productive, because we shouldn't equate criticism with review writing. Reviews are one important genre, but there are other genres of critical writing, and I don't see why curators would not be able to write various critical texts.
Are there any other curator critics on the panel?
I would like to
Just a short comment, and I'll pass on the mic to you, that I would actually like to open up the floor for any questions concerning any of the previous panels, but also the lecture that Jörg Heiser gave us earlier today. So please feel free to comment on any of the things you've heard today or ask questions. Thanks.
Listening to you, I think that we must maybe change the concept of independence. And we can use the concept of negotiator inside of the independence or autonomy, because we are all in the situation of negotiation with institutions, with as a curator, as art writers or critics, like that. And maybe the negotiation is more adequate to our situation than independence, which is the concept of the third world, the independence of war, like that. Maybe we can abandon it.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question and also an alternative term for independence. I was thinking it would have been maybe more interesting starting point to call this panel "I'm for an art criticism that is not censored." Not censored, like as in censorship. Yeah, and what I wanted, the question I wanted to say, because I rather liked Aimee Lin's comment that branding is the 2012 word for reputation. Don't you think it would have been more useful if, considering that you're all at this table with the spotlight on and the names in front of you, you all admit that you've done a pretty good branding jobs with your lives, so you would use that as a starting point of this discussion and maybe go from there rather than just using all this time for challenging whether that's where you are or not, because it's pretty clear, to me at least, that that's the starting point, and yeah, that this discussion has just challenged something that's obvious already. Okay.
So you're saying everybody on this panel has already branded themselves? Okay. Would everyone agree with that?
It's probably true. It's just not all of us have hairstylists, but yeah.
Well, I would also argue in this day and age, everyone brands themselves.
For me, it was very remarkable that when the question came up about the reader, not only 2 of the 5 panel members gave an answer. While I think as an art critic, you are not only writing for your peers. It's not only a conversation between each other, but you also write for a reader, for a public. And I wonder if any of the panel members could give an answer, what kind of reader they have in mind when they write.
I guess there are different categories of readers, and I would say that for me, precisely to prevent this phenomenon of kind of basically treating the reader as an idiot, it's quite a good starting point to sort of start with, people that you know who you think might be interested, so peers, but they need not necessarily be. And then there's always the function of a text as, a message in a bottle, which is this Adornian image that I quite like. So yes, you write for people you don't know. You write for an unknown addressee as well as for known addressees. And, it's always a nice surprise when somehow texts find their way and they somehow turn out to have a use, value, and a function for people that you didn't know. But I wouldn't make a sort of a radical difference between the people that I do know, the readers that I do know, and then the unknown readers, the unknown addressees. And of course, it's different. Again, it also depends on context. It also depends on the medium. But yeah, I mostly write for, let's say, media or mediums that do have sort of a more specialist audience, for want of a better word. It's a terrible term. And so I don't really need the urge or the need to differentiate and to create some kind of abstract image of a reader that I need to reach. Basically, I know some readers and others I don't, but for me, they don't exist on different planets.
But you don't have an image of that, who that person is, specifically? I'm just curious, because I do. I personally do, but I'm just curious.
What kind of image do you have?
I always say I write for my husband.
Okay.
I actually do. Yeah. I mean, I feel like sometimes when
sure.
I
mean, I could name some people that I write for. Of course. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Very good.
I learned most about that when starting to write for a newspaper, because that's so different than from writing for a specialist magazine. And there I learned, thanks to the editors, of course, that you have to attract the audience and keep them interested in what you are writing. So you write a sort of cliffhanger in every passage, and it is. And since then, I'm much more conscious about it, so to say. And of course, what Sven says, it's also depending on the media. So the writing that I do for the website of Metropolis is quite different from what I do for the magazine, and also because the audience is so much bigger for the website. And so there is, in that sense, there is always a reader on my mind, although in a general sense, it will always stay a sort of art-interested audience, of course, and for example, from the newspaper, I know that is the culture section at that moment wasn't read that much, was hardly read, so to say, in comparison with other sections in the magazine. So in that sense, it remains a small part of the total audience that you write for.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question. Because I would like to know what the panel members think about these huge masses that go to big exhibitions like Documenta, etc. Or recently the Stedelijk Museum reopened and thousands of people went to see it. That is a public that I think is a chance for art criticism, but we don't use it. And I would like.
I'm not sure, but the fact is that art criticism is almost everywhere nowadays. So also in fashion magazines and in living magazines, how it's called in lifestyle magazines, etc. So those kinds of people are reached somehow, apparently. So that writing is available already, I think. But no, that's of course. It's most of the time it's information in those kinds of magazines.
Yeah, I guess we live in paradise then in Germany, because I think every single day in Germany there's like 5 exhibition reviews in German newspapers, at least. I don't know if you read German, just go to perlentaucher.de. And it will list you all the reviews, including all other cultural reviews, but it also lists like exhibition reviews and the Süddeutsche Zeitung, the FAZ, the Berliner Zeitung, every single day almost. So I think, I don't know, I can't speak for Holland, but in Germany and in Switzerland and Austria, it's all over the place. And I don't think there's a lack. Sometimes there's maybe a lack of quality, but I don't think there's a lack of quantity. Just as a quick remark to that. But I wanted to ask a question for me, which kind of maybe links this panel to the one about voice. Because for me, the question of independence is directly linked to voice. In some way, your voice squeaks if you're not independent in your text, so to speak. It becomes off-key. Maybe I'm a sort of paranoid reader in that sense, but I sometimes feel that you can really read in the text where the constraints are if you read it against the grain, usually. Well, sometimes it's also made transparent. But I'm wondering, in the process of writing, and that's what I tried to allude to in my keynote when I said sometimes you have to have a sort of temporal amnesia about your constraints to be able to write a good text. You have to kill your darlings, sometimes literally, like to make your point. And I think that's the sort of, I'm not saying that criticism is art, but there's a parallel in that criticism needs to achieve what an artist would try to achieve, that at some point when it has to become a really good artwork, they have to also kill the darlings, whether it's within the logic of the work or a certain constraint they feel they just have to cut off to make a good artwork. And in some way, a good piece of criticism needs that sometimes too, I think. So I'm wondering how the process of writing for you guys is shaped by the question of constraints and independence.
I mean, it's interesting that you put it this way, because it places independence actually into the realm of the subject. It's a claim rather than a kind of a structural given, right? So it's actually, so this relates a bit to your question about. I mean, there is this kind of credo in art that you don't pander to. You should never pander to an audience. You should always produce the audience with what you do, right? It's a kind of very idealistic idea. But it's a very important one. So rather than you're always expected to imagine your ideal audience and sort of produce this audience in your writing, right? In an essay. So I mean, I think it takes, when you write, you take for granted that you are writing to an audience. When you think, you think for yourself. When you write, you're always addressing. There's always an addressee. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know, actually the point about the German media is quite interesting, because I read the German media on a daily basis. I check Perlentaucher every day. I do see a problem in Holland in that the donkerized Dutch newspapers really have this attitude of basically talking down to people. So I've really developed an allergy. I'm no longer able to read Volkskrant or NRC. Because there is this extreme sort of divergence and this basically indeed this talking down approach. Whereas with the Süddeutsche, for instance, I still have the feeling that, you know, they take me seriously as a reader. So there is really there are significant differences between public spheres in various European countries. So in Germany, for instance, I wouldn't really say that that's a huge problem in a sense, because people who write for, you know, for Fries or Texte Kunst or whatever are still also writing for newspapers, you know, on the side, or they're writing for the newspapers primarily and for the magazines on the side. So there is more of a sort of course, there's different grades, right? Of course, you wouldn't write for the Süddeutsche, you know, you wouldn't write the exact text. The exact same text that you would write for Texte Kunst, but you are able to sort of cover the spectrum and function in both contexts. Here in Holland, I just don't see that anymore, frankly, personally.
Does anybody from one of the former panels want to chime in with any of these? Because obviously these questions were more than just for this panel.
I'd like to raise a question that has been touched upon before about the aims of art criticism, about the why of it, because we've heard two tentative answers, which were basically the role of the art critic as a translator and of the art critic as an artist or a literary figure in his own right, which are mutually exclusive, because you can't be both a translator and, say, independent in your own right. And they're both not really satisfactory, because the one is really belletristic. You're writing art criticism as some sort of literary independent genre. And the other is, well, let's say it, idolatrous in translating this deeper message of art and conveying to the benighted populace that deeper message that is in the artwork, etc. So my question is, okay, to what extent does art criticism require an agenda? Or to make it more personally, what gets you out of bed? Why are you doing it? Why are you into it?
Does anybody want to tackle that?
Anyone that is on this table or from the previous panels, please feel free to jump in. No.
I think as a way to answer that, but also to go back to this idea, we kept going back to this idea of readership and audience, but I don't think readership has to be so immediate. You're not having you don't have to think about the conversation as the readership of the magazine or the people that visit a blog on a certain day. I think as a writer or an artist or a historian, you're working in a historical field. So you can imagine that your readership are people 100 years ago or 50 years ago or much further back, or something speculative and in the future. What you're doing is you're carrying on a larger conversation that is not, it's not about style or fashion. So you don't need some sort of immediate response, you know. It's something quite a bit larger, and I think it can have a necessity that goes beyond simply sort of rehashing this idea of like the conditions of the market and how you find yourself in. I mean, I think these conditions have always existed. They've always existed. They're always going to change and sort of morph, but will always be within them. And anybody who works in any field is under those same conditions in some way or another. But that's not why we write. It's not why we make art. So I just wanted to say again that this idea of readership and your audience, I mean, it can have a larger, more historical dimension than what anybody is sort of
Yeah, and it's important not to enter this, indeed, perhaps idolaters believe into immediate effect, instantaneous effect. Indeed, delays are great. Delays are okay. There may be some future readers, or they may never materialize, but, they're okay too.
I would also argue that they're not mutually exclusive, So I don't know whether I would say that they are. So I think in that way.
I hear a lot about the readers and about art critics. I myself, I'm a visual artist. I work here to be independent, so to say. And I have a question regarding this sound fragment from Godard. And he says that for him it's really important to have the art critic write about the work using arguments, saying because he can learn from it for his next piece. So my question is actually quite simple. It's sort of same question as you already asked, but what's your responsibility towards the art or the artist?
That's a good question. Would you like to take that?
Actually, I was going to mention that point. I mean, my responsibility, I feel, as a writer is to, when I'm writing a piece about an exhibition, is to give the kind of evidence that Godard was talking about. I think, and especially coming from newspaper journalism, I feel the newspaper is much more of a public sphere than other kind of, when you write for a catalogue and so on. I don't have that kind of public responsibility feeling. But when writing for a newspaper, the reader, the responsibility to give this kind of evidence is very important. Also, I think I also do think of the artist when I'm writing. It's also very important to give a kind of evidence about the artist, for sure.
Does Barbara want to mention?
Actually, I would just, before I give the mic to Barbara, I just wanted to add, or not, I don't know, we'll see. But in any case, I just wanted to follow up a little bit with this idea of the responsibility of the writer and perhaps bring this another idea into it, and it's perhaps also linking to what Gwen was saying earlier with this idea of conversation, that the discursive of it all is most likely a process. It's not a statement or a blurb that stops with the text that is written, but it's actually an opening for continuing this conversation. And maybe this is also where the responsibility can evolve and develop. And it's about these different exchanges that we are, for instance, staging right here with these types of conferences.
Sorry, Barbara, I picked you out because as an artist, I thought you would have something to say about the artist, the role of the artist.
No, it's a good question, I would say. What does the artist think? Well, I can speak for all artists now. No. One of my great frustrations is that whenever you make an exhibition, it's all wonderful at the opening, but there is no real interaction concerning whether the work is succeeding in its aims or whether it's what you would have liked it to be. And I see art criticism also as a mediator between what I do and the conversation about it. Because somehow this conversation doesn't happen in the gallery or the museum or the public space where the exhibition takes place. And therefore, I did agree with you, but on the other hand, my question is, when you write, are you aiming to be either understood or forcing a type of friction? I would like the art criticism to be a kind of turning point for the work to be part of a larger story.
No, I think that touches on something I said before too, that that the writing that we do and the art that we're writing about, none of it is made in some sort of vacuum. It's all made in the same sort of landscape and environment, which is full of these larger concerns and ideas. And so whatever text I write, whatever artwork or artist who I'm writing about, we are just part of something, a larger idea. And I think that criticism has, a number of things to follow up on. It, needs to make a certain point. It needs to give evidence. It needs to be clear. But it also should often bring in those larger ideas, so that it takes the work and the artist and it contextualizes them in some larger world. And that what I meant by conversation is that then as a writer also that your work is sort of also contextualizing itself in a larger world of ideas and literature. And that hopefully you're doing that for the artist and their work, and hopefully you're doing that for your own body of writing as it comes out. So that none of these things, and in that way, in some ways, maybe you're also pushing against these market forces, because it doesn't become so topical. It's not just about pushing the artists so their prices go up or they get more PR, they get a better gallery. It's not about making a name for yourself because you have so many bylines. It's about having a larger, bigger conversation.
One small remark to that is that, in my perception, a lot of art criticism is about placing the art within the art context rather than in the context of the rest of the world. And that would be, in my case, more interesting.
Well, I'm happy you brought up this idea of the critic as a mediator, because I think it also touches upon what I was trying to formulate with the critic as a translator and how to move forward with these ideas. But I'm wondering if, instead of just hearing my voice all the time, there are more comments or questions. Can I?
Hello. I wasn't going to say anything, but since Barbara just finished with something that was drifting around in my mind. A couple of months ago, we did a causerie on John Ruskin. I actually went to an art school in Oxford named after Ruskin, so the eponymous Ruskin Art School. He was always viewed at the time as some archaic figure that young post-YBA art students shouldn't really interest themselves in. But when we did the causerie, it became very apparent that he was a thinker, well, maybe that's the right word, a thinker, a writer, a critic, definitely not a detached person, definitely more of the auteur that we mentioned before. And we actually did one on a causerie on the mountain. And we looked at a book by Ruskin called Modern Painters, Volume 4, which is an enormous book used in a way to justify Turner's landscape paintings. And rather than in a Greenbergian way delve through art history, he goes off to the Alps and engages in the most incredible amateur geology I've ever seen anybody do. Puts most people to shame, to the point that it's obsessive. It has a sort of Zuckerberg-Asperg syndrome quality to it. Now I wonder, are there any parallels? Are there people within your field who are also within this field of art criticism but able to operate outside of it, more idiosyncratic voices, people who you feel have a larger cultural perspective? Because obviously I don't want to devalue criticism in any way. It's a wonderful and important thing. but at the same time, we seem to have only discussed Castle, Manifesta, curators, independent curators, occasionally artists, you know, the lowest of the low, gallerists, art fairs. It would be like a discussion about theatre where we just talked about agents and light grids, but we never talked about Shakespeare and beauty and horror and these kind of things. So I forgive, I've made a rather rambling statement, but didn't really end up in a pertinent question, which I apologize for, because I don't like it when people do that. But does any of what I'm saying, because I feel like it's an idiosyncratic viewpoint, but I am a artist, and in some ways I'm echoing what Barbara is talking about. This is something that inspires us in a very direct way, because if Godard wants to receive something in his criticism, it can be very direct and very, I like the way he used the word technical. If someone analyzes one of your films and says the montage here, the plot construction, I disagree with this or that, it's very useful, but at the same time, it's not necessarily inspiring in a more general way, in the way that Ruskin has been. I will just finish by citing Marcel Proust, who probably wouldn't have had the same impact on the world, and I think it's a hugely important impact, if it wasn't for Ruskin. Proust is enormously the progeny of Mr. Ruskin. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure that this will satisfy you in any way, probably not. But it is a very interesting question. And I find it hard to come up with someone who, you know, like Ruskin goes to the Alps and basically practices a kind of geological criticism. But I would like to say this, one magazine, one context, one group that I've been involved with, associated with, was that of the journal or magazine Open, which was published by SCORE and which now no longer exists in its old form. But in one of the most recent issues, I mean, in the next to last issue actually, in the one issue before the final one that's just come out now, there was actually an article by John Byrne that dealt with Ruskin and that discussed Ruskin in the context of the debate around useful art. And another name that has been associated with Open, someone who has been involved with Open, is Brian Holmes. And you know, Brian to me is someone who's quite interesting in that he's not actually an art critic, or if he is an art critic, he's not the type of art critic who writes reviews. He produces writings that have a relation with contemporary art, that are relevant, that function in this context, but that are not actually your old school art criticism. I would say that he, for instance, does contextualize art in a much wider cultural, socio-political framework. And Open was actually built as a cahier on art and the public domain, and it did not contain traditional reviews, and it contained relatively few articles that one would characterize as sort of traditional art writing. This to me was one interesting way of actually developing a form of art criticism that tried to come to terms with some of the constraints that we encounter in the traditional art media and the traditional platforms. So to me it was a very interesting project, but of course it is not a project that is of any interest to the contemporary Mondrian Fund, so we'll have to see whether we can continue it in some online form with, you know, without authors getting paid for articles and such. But okay, this was sort of via Ruskin and John Byrne, an attempt to point out that there are forms of writing in the context of contemporary art that are very much take a broader perspective and that try to use art to produce a kind of cultural criticism or cultural critique, as Brian would perhaps put it, that has its basis, its roots in contemporary art, but that pushes things to a point where perhaps it's no longer even art criticism, but it's still unimaginable without contemporary art.
The closest person I can think of when you just immediately said that was someone like Ken Johnson of the New York Times, who did that book about psychedelia and drugs and sort of tied that into like art and consciousness and that type of thing. That's the closest I could immediately think of.
Or Lars Bang Larsen, if we're discussing psychedelia.
So, I mean, I guess that happens a little bit, but I think in the age of professionalization of art, it's become a little difficult. I mean, the amount of time commitment you need just to see what you're supposed to be seeing is actually pretty substantial, you know. Does anyone have any other thoughts?
I was thinking that you have all kinds of platforms for this different kind of art writing. So Cabinet Magazine is the most known, I guess, and in the Netherlands you have Ahu David, which is on art and writing and in all kinds of different ways than the more classic art critical form. So there you can find several writers who practice it in this way.
Maybe I would add to that actually the other way around, how critics use theories and concepts that actually come from philosophers, sociologists, and how this has completely been embedded within art theory in general and the way we talk about art. But on that note, we are way over time, and we do not have time for a closing, which was meant to be the reading by Adam Kleinman, and the reading was a response by Dan Fox to Klaus Oldenburg's I Am for an Art. But I think we all can come to the consensus that we are very grateful to everyone today here and for your attention especially, and bearing with us in this really interesting evening. And I would like to invite you all to the consensus bar downstairs. But above all, I am very grateful to all the guests and all the voices and all the contributions that we've had here. And please join us again tomorrow at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. We start at 4 p.m. It's not over yet. It keeps on going. Thank you.